full communion with God, and therefore with each other. And that doesn't occur in the story until Jesus ascends. So resurrection, glory, hallelujah, death has been conquered. But for what? Not just so we can live forever, but so that we can be in the presence of God. That's salvation. Not just living forever, not just avoiding hell, but to be reconciled with God and to be in full presence of God and therefore in right relation with the neighbor. So anyway, the ascension might actually be key to the story.
Yeah, but he had to hang around for the 40 days because the Holy Comforter had not yet come. So there was more to the story.
Right, sure. So good. I mean, nice of him to hang around for a while, right?
And to go to the upper room.
But it's not done yet until Jesus, as the first fruits, is in the full presence of God, and that supposedly is where we're all headed.
Yeah.
All right. So, any questions about our move through the traditional doctrine of soteriology, particularly in the way atonement theory has taken central place in the church's thinking about the mechanics of salvation and why that gets done, right, in relationship to Israel's sacrificial cult, etc., and what the problems might be. Any last things before we move on to Dolores Williams' particular critique of that tradition? You all just want to get out of here, and I don't blame you. All right, Dolores Williams. African-American womanist theologian who spent a lot of time at Union, was taught here for a while, so she's one of ours. And I just want to highlight some key things about the wider context of the work she's doing in that book that provides the context for then her really zeroing on what she sees as the problematic nature of vicarious or substitutionary atonement as death-dealing news rather than life-giving news for African American women. So the wider context, as a womanist theologian, she's operating in my paradigm C. We've been calling liberationists sort of the first wave, WilliamsCone, Latin American liberationists, generally a male-dominated discourse, and then feminist theology. Not only a white woman's discourse, but often seen as a majority white woman's discourse in the early years. And so then you have the rise of womanist discourse, womanist theology, where African American women of color, are saying, wait, something is getting left, something of our experience as African American women is getting left out of the feminist discourse. And as African American women, it's getting left out of the black liberationist discourse. WilliamsCone is leaving us out, and Elizabeth Johnson is leaving us out. So we got to do our own, we got to speak in our own voice from the distinctiveness of our own experience. So that's womanist theology emerged in continuity with, but also in resistance to, both feminist theology in the way that it particularly was being articulated by from white women's experience, and then black liberation theology, the way it was being articulated from black male experience. All right, so as a paradigm C womanist theologian, what's the primary source for her theology? Experience, and any particular kind of experience?
African.
Right. Of her particular community, African American women's historical experience. And she comes up with a name, a category to define the main form of that experience. And all its diversity, of course. But how does she categorize African American women's experience in the U.S.? We already talked about it.
Surrogacy.
Right, surrogacy. And coerced surrogacy, I think surrogacy. Spell check. Right. So African American women's experience, and that has a very particular nature to it. Coerced surrogacy as the broad definition for African American women's experience. She's just very clear. She's a womanist. She's operating out of my paradigm C. She begins with particular historical experience of her community in its experience of oppression, in particular coerced surrogacy, and struggle for liberation, but also survival. And this is one way in which she argues with James Cone and black theology of liberation. If we look at the story of Hagar, God does not always liberate. God did not liberate Hagar, at least not right away, from slavery. God told her to go back in the story. Of course, eventually then, she leaves and God meets her and Ishmael in the wilderness and provides a way where there is no way. So Dolores Williams, on the positive side, the struggle and experience of oppression in its particular form that this community experiences it, and the struggle for liberation, yes, but we have to modify that with the notion of survival, quality of life. That from the African American women's experience, we notice the part of the biblical testimony that reminds us that we're always not liberated right away. God might be a God of liberation, but not always right away. Sometimes God provides ways to sustain quality of life in the wilderness. So she talks about survival as another hermeneutical category that we need alongside liberation in the African American community for our theology. All right, so she's doing paradigm C stuff, beginning with particular historical experience, and so she has that in common with James Cone and Elizabeth Johnson, but she is arguing also against them. She's underlining a difference. As an African American woman, she has much in common with feminists because she's talking about women's experience. But she's critiquing Elizabeth Johnson because Dolores Williams is talking about African American women's experience. And much feminism done by white feminists leaves that particular dimension of women's experience out. White women tend to focus on, we're talking about women's experience of the oppression of patriarchy, and they assume women's experience is a general category that speaks for all women, and they don't notice that as white women, they're talking about their experience as a woman, and their experience of category of patriarchy as a woman, and they're not aware in which other women have experiences of patriarchy that might be different from them. Other experiences that are not just the oppression of a male-dominated society, but the oppression of a racist male-dominated society. And so white women's feminism has done a good job of critiquing patriarchy in terms of male-dominated society, but has not talked about how white women themselves are part of the racist oppressive structure over African American women and men. So in racism, white women are part of a racist structure that oppress African American women and men, the African American community as a whole, and feminist theology, in its strongest and best voice, has not done enough to critique itself and implicate itself in that form of oppression, because it's only focused on patriarchy as male domination, and hasn't been self-aware enough about how white women are complicit in racist oppression of the African American community. So that's her critique, on the one hand, with feminists, emphasizing a particular experience, but she's doubling down on the particularity. It's not just as a woman, it's as an African American woman. So she has things in common with white feminists, but then she has a bone to pick with white feminists. It's not just about patriarchy as male domination, it's also about racism as white supremacy. And that implicates white feminists in a way that white feminism hadn't been doing a good job of acknowledging, but now that womanist theologians are coming out, white feminism has revealed that reality. And then in Elizabeth Johnson, you see a white feminist theologian who is hearing the testimony of Dolores Williams and other womanists and trying to recalibrate and trying to honor the way that feminist theology can't simply be about patriarchy, but also has to be about racism and classism and all the other directional, intersectional forces of structures of oppression. On the other hand, she's like James Cone, focusing on experience of a particular community, the black community. But again, she's doubling down on the particularity. So for her, it's not just the black community, it's African American women in that community. So James Cone focusing on the experience of the black community is too broad. It leaves out the particular experience of women in that community, particularly the way women suffer under the male domination of patriarchy within that community. So within the African American community itself suffers from racism, but African American women in that community also suffer from patriarchy, not just from white men, but from black men as well. And black liberation theologians like Cone don't address that problem self-critically enough. That there's something about African American women's experience that he doesn't name and address and bring to the center. And that's why wominists have to claim their own particular identity and bring their voice into the conversation in both clearly liberationist, focusing on experience, but also in a way that distinguishes them from other liberationist discourses. So that's the general location of Dolores Williams as a womanist theology. That's when womanist theology enters into the liberationist discourse between the early liberationist dudes and feminist theology and womanist theology. And the key category that womanists introduce is this notion of the oppressed of the oppressed, the doubly oppressed. So as African American women, they're doubly oppressed, both by patriarchy and by sexism. They are the oppressed of the oppressed. They're oppressed as members of the black community because of white racism, but they're also oppressed within the black community because of patriarchy. So there's this double layer of oppression, which also means, even perhaps more radically, that the oppressed can also be an oppressor. So white women are oppressed by patriarchy, but they are complicit in the oppression of their sisters of color through racism. Same for black men. They're oppressed by white racism, but they're complicit in patriarchy's oppression of their sisters of color through patriarchy. So this really gets complicated now. Suddenly we can't just, and if we're going to be liberationists and feminists, we can't just talk about oppressor and the oppressed. That's powerful language. We have to have that language to do the work the liberation theology needs. But that's immediately not complex enough, right? Because even the oppressed can also be the oppressor in some ways. And we have to pay fine, close attention to the particularities and complexities of oppression. And suddenly oppression itself isn't just good guys, bad guys over good guys. It's not just patriarchy. It's also racism. It's also homophobia. It's also classism. It's intersectional lines of oppression all happening at the same time. And that notion of intersectionality and the doubly oppressed and that the oppressed can also be the oppressor, that enters the conversation with womanist theology. Womanist theology was really the first through the door once they started talking about what it meant to be both African American and women. Then things changed for everybody. And all liberationists had to start talking about the intersectional complexity of oppression. It wasn't just one thing. And so liberation theology has just been incredibly productive over the last 20, 30, 40 years as it has rediscovered the real complex depths of structures of oppression that calls for more and more intense, more and more articulate, more and more focused forms of discourse and attention and listening to each other, etc. All right, so let's talk about coerced surrogacy, her particular form of oppression experienced by her community, and how she fills that out. And this is where you've gotten bits and pieces of this in some of the odd pages I've had you read through the semester. She doesn't get to fill this out fully in the 6 pages on atonement you read for this week. So I'll just remind you of some of the context and fill that out, because you need that then for her, the real meat of her critique of substitutionary atonement. Coerced surrogacy. A lot of her book, most of it is describing the different dimensions and levels of this experience through African American history and African American women's history. So obviously, slavery comes to mind. That's obvious coerced labor surrogacy, right? Human beings forced to labor, to do labor for the plantation owner. It's surrogacy because they're doing labor instead of others in slave conditions. And that's the obvious deep history of African American women's surrogacy as being part of slavery. But Dolores Williams says coerced surrogacy for AFAM women didn't end with slavery. In fact, it continues to this very day. And she kind of takes us through a history. There's slavery. Then there's the post-slavery. There's the Black Mammy period, where you still have coerced surrogacy. This is surrogate mothers. You have black mothers mothering their own children, but then also mothering white children. And that continues long after slavery, and even today you still have, as part of slavery, you had that involved sex surrogacy. So African American women slaves were sex surrogates for the slave master. Could use them and take them and use them for sex because, of course, they weren't. They couldn't say no. So there was a sex surrogacy dimension to slavery. You've got the Black Mammy, which is mother parenting surrogacy. That continues today with domestic work, working as cleaners, nannies now. We don't call them Black Mammies anymore, but now we have nannies, domestic cleaners. All that kind of work that is for many African American women, the only work that is available to them. And so, sure, you could say that's surrogate work, right? So you're doing house cleaning for the white house owners, but is that coerced surrogacy? And a lot of Dolores Williams' book will be making economic and social arguments about the history of African Americans in this country that have resulted in limited access to opportunity and to education, so that African American women and women of color more generally are placed in economic circumstances because of coercive forces, out of necessity, that make this kind of work the only available sustainable kind of work they can get. And so the coercion remains in place. It's not slavery, but it's coercion by very particular capitalist economic forces that are organized to privilege the white community over the black community and those with money over the poor. So there's still a coercive effect in terms of domestic work. And then there's the, she says, even today, there's the father surrogacy. Talks about the absentee fathers, the single parent responsibilities for a lot of African women, doing the work of both parents, and that has been part of the African American women's experience. So in all these ways, she roots it in slavery, but she wants to make sure that we're not able to locate this in the past. This is a continued determinative characteristic of African American women's experience through American history and continues even today. So this is the case she makes through the whole book. All these different dimensions of surrogacy, coerced surrogacy, both in terms of patriarchy, male-dominated society, and in terms of racism. So she has a lot of work to do in her book before she gets to the atonement stuff. All right, so, and if this is African American women's experience, coerced surrogacy, we've already pointed at this. She gets to, okay, now let's look at our Christian gospel and our Christian theology and the great good news of God's for us in the death of Jesus Christ on the cross. Why suddenly, if we're beginning with the experience of African American women as coerced surrogacy as our most authoritative source, and then we get to the scriptural testimony about Jesus' atoning death on the cross as a form of Jesus taking our place and suffering for us, taking the bullet for us so that we might live. What's the problem for her? Why does African American women's experience suddenly cast a shadow over how good a news atonement theory of salvation can be? Yeah.
The model of Jesus is as a surrogate who's oppressed and is supposed to suffer.
Yeah. Atonement theory is a form of surrogacy. Jesus, the Son, is sent to take our place and to suffer and die in our place. This is a form of divine surrogacy. And Dolores Williams' problem is the way that has then held its place in the life and the faith of the church often means that we celebrate the cross as the locus and the mechanism of our salvation as a form of divine surrogacy. Isn't it great? Doesn't God love us so much? God takes our place, suffers for us on the cross as our surrogate, as our substitutionary atonement. And so then, how does that play out pastorally? We've already mentioned this a little bit. So, what does it mean then to become Christ-like? Suffer like Christ. We sacralize divine surrogacy as the good saving stuff. And so then when we look at African American women's experience of surrogacy as suffering of oppression, what does the church say to them? Get the hell out of there! Liberate yourselves from that coerced surrogacy. No, it says, oh, bless your hearts! You're being Christ-like. Jesus was the divine surrogate. And your experience of coerced surrogacy in white racism and patriarchal cultures is you're participating in the suffering of Jesus. Bless your heart, jewel in your crown, jewel in your heavenly crown.
Use the model of Mary, how she suffered. Mary suffered and didn't have a choice in the matter.
Yeah, well, and she's once she starts looking, there's all sorts of biblical stories that she can turn to. So her problem is that is not a saving word for African American women. If that's the gospel, if that's the word of the gospel, seen through the theory of atonement, salvation, substitutionary atonement, the gospel is telling African American women, stay in your oppressed situation.
Suck it up. Suffer.
Suck it up. Right. Stay there and suffer. This gets, pardon?
And don't be bitter.
And don't be bitter. No, because then you're not being Christ-like, right? Christ freely offered himself to suffer in our place. So you be Christ-like in that situation. This really gets painful in the church's pastoral failure around domestic abuse. Time after time, women being threatened and abused in their home relationships, in their primary intimate relationships, go to pastor and say, what do I do? And pastor says, be Christ-like in that situation. For his sake. Right? Your sufferings, if you hang in there with him and endure that suffering with joy and see it as participating in Christ's suffering, then he's always got hope, right? You can always bring him around. Is that the good news of the gospel? Dolores Williams is going to say, I'm sorry, as African American women, that is not. No. That is death-dealing news. Indeed, how many women have died?
That's right.
Because their pastors didn't say, get the hell out of there now. That is God's will for you. God's will for you is to live. Loving someone does not mean allowing them to kill you.
That's right.
That's not loving them. They're not benefiting from that, right? Get out of there. The church has failed in proclaiming the gospel to women in general, and in particular African American women, around domestic abuse, because we've valorized suffering. This is how you participate in Christ's suffering. This is how you become Christ-like. This is God's will for you. Endure it. Find joy. God is tempering you and teaching you and strengthening you for great things. Now, there might be experiences and difficulties and forms of suffering that we might pastorally, even ourselves, think that could be an appropriate response. But if that's our only response to all forms of suffering, particularly forms of suffering that we endure because of unjust, oppressive structures that are degrading and threatening our very humanity, we have to have another response if this is going to be the word of life and not death. That's Dolores Williams. That's the eye of the storm of her critique of atonement theory. This stuff about Jesus on the cross is not a life-giving word to African American women if we take their particular experience seriously. And again, right, we're doing theological method. What does this story look like if we begin in a particular place with a particular source as authoritative? The particular source being African American women's experience. Suddenly, how this story reads can look very different. It can be a story of dark shadow of judgment and death rather than of life, a life-giving affirmation. So, any questions about that move of her critique of atonement theory based on African American women's experience of of coerced surrogacy? Because atonement is a form of divine surrogacy, and that's toxic. That's going to be toxic. Yeah.
Maybe this is a question for down the road, but is her intent to replace the atonement theory with the theory that she, the ministerial theory?
Right.
Because there are forms of suffering that are not related to oppression.
Right.
So are we looking to substitute or have the two coexist?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question, and that's why I said, I stepped back from it and said, right, there are forms of suffering that might be not due to forms of oppression. So, the fact that we can learn and grow through different forms of suffering might always not be out of place, but in particular instances, sure. So let's keep that question open for us when we get to her alternative. Is this a replacement or is this an addition to try to fill out the picture and give us more options? My tendency, I think, is I hear her as pushing more for a replacement and then coming up with alternatives to address the other forms of suffering that aren't necessarily from oppression, but a call for a distinctive pastoral response. But I think for her, we need to get clear of this because it's poisoning the well. And then let's be creative theologically and then come up with the other kinds of language we need in other situations. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to start from this side of it. If we're going to the atonement theory, I see the black mommy, the master walk, and what have you. In my own context, economically, anyone who has in abundance, the rest of the people who do not have may, like they said, I'm speaking for the African context. I don't know about here.
Yeah.
I don't know the black context here.
Right.
Why they are very bitter about things concerning what's going on.
Yeah.
But if the white are very economical in the society,
Yeah.
and then you black in the society do not have automatically whatsoever you do, you still gonna render some services to the one that have.
Yeah.
That's the example of Africa.
Yeah.
So as long people have the Ima community,
Right.
the lower needs
Yeah.
are the millionaires in my community.
Yeah.
So almost in our own home,
Yeah.
we serve the lower needs people.
Yeah.
Because they ride the best of car, they can water the water, and whatsoever.
Yeah.
So if it is so, Is that being considered an abuse? You answer that later on to the atonement theory.
Yeah,
I move to the atonement theory
yeah,
that all of us, whether white or black, all of us have some suffering to bear.
yeah,
Because Jesus said, anyone who wants to follow me
yeah.
must pick up the cross and follow me. And the cross is not like a piece of paper.
Right.
It is a heavy thing.
Yes, it
So
is.
whether you white, you black, you feminine, you male, you got some cross to
Yes,
carry.
we do.
Right.
So
Amen.
I look at it
Yes,
different.
yes.
Yeah, good question, and this is where the argument happens, largely between liberationist folks and traditional folks, and sometimes progressive folks who get nervous about focusing too much on historical, particular historical experiences of depression, of oppression. I'm just going to say two quick things, and then just highlight that that's precisely what the argument is about. Are we all equally suffering? We all have a cross to bear. So the distinctions between the slave and the slave owner aren't important for God or for the story? Or can we say, yes, we all have sufferings to bear, we all bear crosses, but the fact that one of us has our boot heel on the back of another's neck while we're both carrying our crosses is not to be ignored. That is also part of the sin and the suffering that God cares about, right? So that's part of the argument is, for liberationists, they're concerned that if we just say, hey, everybody suffers, so we're all equal, then the slave owner can say, hey, I get depressed sometimes too. By the way, if you don't go cut more sugarcane, I'm going to string you up and whip you until you are this short of death. But man, I get depressed sometimes, huh, gang? And so I'm equal with the guy I'm almost beating to death. If we lose that difference, that's a real concern for liberationists. And they'll say, and it should be concern for everybody. It should be concern for traditional Christians, that grieves God. God wants to address that and save that, not just the way we are all equally burdened by sin. So that's just a great, you put your finger on how that conversation and argument goes and what are the concerns for both sides. I was going to say one other just quick thing. Right. So there's a way in which Dolores Williams is talking about her particular community, African American women's experience, right? And so, in particular, oppression of patriarchy and oppression of racism, but she will also talk about economic factors, right? So it's also about economics and economic differences and class differences, and that's part of where she sees how even domestic work today, just like you say, when there's rich people and people without, the people without work in the rich people's houses, right? That's how it goes. Dolores Williams would say, yes, so in the context of Africa, those economic forces, that is a form of coerced surrogacy. People without access are forced to have no other option than to work as servants in other people's houses, and that is a sign of a sinful economic structure that puts people of leisure as employees in power over people less economically advantaged who rely on the other people for their very livelihood. And that would be a way to say economic forces like racism, like sexism, capitalism, and market forces, when seen as necessary and natural, are examples of systematic oppression, sinful systems. The way that those who have are able to get more at the expense of those who don't, are struggling to compete for less and less. So that would be, I think Dolores Williams would say, yeah, in the context of Africa, you could say that you could use this concept of coerced surrogacy to describe the economic situation in Africa between the elites and the haves and the have-nots. But then there's a lot more to say there. Was there another? Yeah, TJ.
Well, this is really easy for me to say as a white male.
Of course, I feel you.
But why are we so stuck on the good news in the now,
Right.
instead of the good news that's still to come? Like, I understand and agree that, no, this isn't good news now
Right,
for
right,
this.
right.
But
I mean,
there's
sort of the traditional notion that saving from sin is the eschatological gift is really where we're headed. It's not about liberation now, it's
Yeah.
about salvation.
I mean, like, I think that probably there's a place where both of those, like, there is some good news now, there is,
Right, yeah.
but there's still good news
Yeah,
ahead, but we seem so focused on that, like, I click it now and I get it instantly
Yeah.
type of thing
Right.
within our culture, and I'm concerned about that thought.
yeah. You're right, that's easier for you to ask.
Oh, I know, I know.
What comes to mind, I mean, that might just be the best answer for that. But there's two things that occur to me. One is, what's the MLK phrase? Justice deferred is justice denied.
Yeah.
That it's when it's your ass in jail,
I know that's right.
things look different.
Absolutely.
When it's your life on the line walking down the street just because your skin is a certain color, there's a level of urgency. So I think that the liberationist response would be, there is good reason for a sense of urgency that there is liberation and salvation now. And again, liberationists are going to disagree in the sense of which it's all about now and we have to let go of the eschatological things, that's always going to be a distraction, or that we have to see the eschatological promise as being incarnated, right? It starts now. But of course, for a future. So there's going to be difference, but I think the way you introduce your question is also the response. And I don't say this because I know it, I say it because this is what I've been told, because I'm sitting at the top of the pile. These aren't urgent issues for me. I can get by without taking this stuff seriously. I mean, physically survive. Other folks can't physically survive without taking that seriously. And if that's you, then they would say, well, it's easy for you to say, TJ. So I think that's, the concern is, I think, even shared with liberationists, as I say, it's not, we would want to distinguish salvation now, get us out of Egypt now, from, the culture of being unable to delay satisfaction, right? That kind of immaturity. I want it now, 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 now. I want to not be ground into the ground now. Might be different from I want this product now. But we would want to make those distinctions. And I think liberationists would say, yeah, there's a certain culture that we live in today that is a consumerist and just wants now, now, now. But when your life is on the line in these particular ways, we can make the urgency distinct from that and still preserve it and still see it within the context of a... Does that somewhat open up a way forward, right, for that conversation to happen? All right, we got a few more minutes to wrap up. Was there anyone else with their hand up before we move to Dolores Williams' alternative?
No.
Great. All right, so let's say, in response to Catherine's question, probably we need to process theology and divine omnipotence. That's just a theological mistake that the old dudes made. We need to let that go. I think Dolores Williams would say vicarious atonement is too toxic for African American women. It poisons the well. We need to replace that with something else. So what is her alternative? And I want us to go through this in a nice doctrinal web sort of way. So we're moving now from her critique of the tradition for very specific reasons to now her constructive proposal as a remedy for the sake of this story, right? So we can still continue to have these doctrines tell the story of the gospel in certain ways, but so that it'll be, from her perspective, life-giving, particularly for African American women and women of color, as well as for the world. So we are saved from, for Dolores Williams, what are we saved from? Just in general. Right? Oppression, right? And sin, seen as structural oppression, right? This is where she's a liberationist, right? She's paradigm C. She understands sin primarily in terms of systemic structural forces that oppress communities while privileging others, and therefore denigrating all of our humanity. So we're saved from sin, yes, but sin is seen as structural forces of oppression. And that's clearly puts her in the liberationist camp. So sin as historical, structural oppression. We're saved by, this is where it starts to get interesting. Right, so if we were traditional, Paradigm A folks, we're saved by, yeah, Jesus, the death of Jesus, life and death of Jesus. So Jesus has got to be there. Because remember, Christology and soteriology, where salvation is the work of Jesus. Who is Jesus? The one who saves us. So she's not saying Jesus isn't involved. So we're saved by Jesus, understood in a certain way, and in what particular part of Jesus?
Ministerial vision.
The ministerial vision of Jesus. As opposed to the death of Jesus. The cross does not save. That's a radical reinterpretation of the Christian doctrine of salvation. Atonement stuff has got to go. The cross, there's nothing salvific in the violence and the suffering and the torture of the cross. That is a grotesque, horrifying picture, and it's been at the heart of Christian faith for centuries. There is a fountain filled with blood drawn from the Savior's veins, and sinners plunged beneath that flood of blood lose all their guilty stains. But that outfit's going to go because that blood does not come out. Right? I've sang that song since I was in second grade since I was in kindergarten. What am I singing? It's about a fountain filled with blood drawn from an open vein that I'm going to get plunged into. It's just grotesque. It's horrifying. And that's been at the center of I love to tell the story will be, right? There's this really, especially for outsiders, it's like, it's a grotesque, horrifying story. And the traditional church has been so used to it, it just flows off the tongue. Yeah, I'm plunged beneath a flood of blood. You know, what's the Jack Nicholson movie about the hotel up in the north? The Shining? You know the scene when the blood comes pouring out of the walls? That's a flood of blood. All right, so part of what Lois Williams and feminists now more generally, not just womanists, are trying to alert us to is at the center of the traditional understanding of the great good news of God for us in Jesus is a horrific act of torture.
Right.
And shouldn't that bother us more than it does? Now, what I've tried to argue for, at least show a possibility of, is that there's a traditional way to say, yes, that's true, and that itself is theologically powerful and important. It tells us something about who God is that isn't just scary and bad. It tells us how the lengths God will go to be for us, even when she knows we're going to kill her. She's still going to come. She wants us that bad, she'll stop at nothing, even death on the cross. If you take the cross out of the equation, I can't say that about how much God wants me and you and even my enemy. Right? So there's ways to honor the horror of the cross at the center of the story that might avoid or at least attend to the ways that can become very problematic when you've got 6-year-olds singing about being drowned in a flood of blood. All right, so Jesus, his mysterial vision is what saves us. He brings an ethical vision of survival and quality of life, of mutual blessing and interdependent community that is salvation. We're not saved by the blood, we're saved by Jesus' ministerial teaching, the prophetic. She moves the center to the prophetic teaching office of Jesus rather than the priestly. So we're saved in Jesus, yeah, but not because Jesus is God incarnate, not because Jesus died on the cross, because Jesus brought a prophetic teaching of ministerial vision that shows us how to live in the way God wants us to live. how to live in right relationship. And that is biblical salvation. That's what we're called to. Again, not sitting on a cloud with playing a harp, singing hymns, living together in created material reality in right relation. Mutual blessing, interdependence with God at the center so that we can all live in communion and fellowship. All right. So saved to, well, I just answered that question. Saved to, in other words, eschatology. Well, saved to human creaturely flourishing. Primarily not to an eschatological vision of the hereafter. Saved to employing this ministerial vision so that we can live in right relationship. We can dismantle structures of injustice so we can be sisters and brothers, not slaves and slave owners. So saved to this historical salvation, whether or not, whatever the eschaton looks like, she leaves open for us. At least at this point, the focus is on creaturely life now as living in right relationship. So there you have the gospel story, sin, Christology, salvation, reinterpreted through a womanist lens. So what then? What do we say? Oh, no. Sorry. What do we say about the cross? Do we just ignore it?
No.
Does it have no theological role to play? It's a symbol, yes, of what? Sin. Cross isn't how we're saved. Cross isn't a symbol of salvation. The cross is a symbol of sin. It's a symbol of how we resist the ministerial vision that Jesus brings us. It's a version of what I was saying earlier. God comes to us, and the cross tells us we are the ones that demand that Jesus dies. Not God. We're the ones that demand that Jesus dies. The cross does have a theological role to play. It's not a symbol of salvation through death. It's a symbol of sin, of our resistance to God's plan for us and God's desire for us. We want to live in our own selfish, internalized way, not for the flourishing of all. And what about resurrection? Does that have, what's the theological significance then of resurrection?
Resistance.
Resistance? Yep. And say more about that?
Like how Jesus resists the sin
Yeah.
of how humanity tried to kill him.
Right.
With the ministerial vision. So he resurrected to overcome that sin.
Right. So resistance, and to show that sin's no to God's ministerial vision isn't the last word, right? Mm-hmm. That the resistance in hope that the ministerial vision will go on. That our resistance to it in sin can never be the final word. So resurrection is a symbol of hope, and a hope not of just, well, hope God comes quickly, but a hope of active resistance, right? A hope that calls us into resistance to continue the work of implementing the ministerial vision of Jesus for the sake of the flourishing of all creatures, mutually and interdependently. So she's targeting sin, she's targeting the cross in a very critical way, but she's not eliminating it. She's giving it a new, powerful theological dimension and meaning, as well as with the cross. So you have the prophetic, the priestly, and the kingly are still there, but they are radically transformed in their theological meaning. And is that all we want to say? It's about that time. What I'm going to do for you, you can thank me later, is I'm going to post on Moodle a schema that has this little tricky thing, saved from, saved by, saved to, etc. There's 3 or 4 things. And I do that for Cone, for the tradition, for the sort of liberal, Paul Tillich version of theology, for Cone, for Dolores Williams. You'll see it. I'll post it on Moodle. And that is just an aid to help you think through every particular position sort of through the story, right? So if I'm Cone and I'm liberationist theology, you've got to think the whole package. What's the understanding of sin? What are we saved from? Who are we saved by, and how are we saved? And what are we saved to, right? So that's a way of thinking how this whole story gets shifted and re-understood through a particular lens, whether it's Cone or Dolores Williams, or the traditional theology of Paradigm A, or a liberal theology of Paul, etc. So look for that on Moodle site. If it's not helpful for you, then don't use it, don't worry about it. It might be helpful for you, yeah.
I don't know whether it was this class that I said approval of a council. I think it was this class.
Approval of
all of these different theories.
right.
Are they being approved by the Bible Society
Right,
or
right.
Council of Churches
Yeah.
or whatever
Yeah.
you, or these people are making their personal view
Right.
to be heard
Yeah.
by the few.
Yeah.
And if I, as an individual and stranger in this land,
Yeah.
take one of these views
Yeah.
and establish it in my community,
Yeah.
and say this is the right I'm going,
Right.
we are not be charged with heritage.
It depends on it depends on what your local context is. If your local church and its governing bodies is very conservative, and you come home with Dolores Williams saying Jesus does not save on the cross, yeah, they'll likely kick you out. If they've got the power to do that. Who has control to say this is what the Christian gospel is and not that? That's what I'm saying. We're looking at all different points of view. And so this is so that you can know your context. Who has the power to say you can be a minister or not, you can do this or not. And so you know what then is your responsibility. First you have to figure out, okay, man, I realize actually I like the liberationist stuff, or I'm more of a universal salvation person, so more of a Paradigm B, not Paradigm A. Drew has kind of screwed me up. Now I'm going to go home, and and my own theological position is now more liberal, or more liberationist, or more progressive than the home church that sent me.
Right, it will.
Okay, now then you have to decide, what's your responsibility? And this is whether you come to us from overseas or whether you come to us from the Midwest, right? This is all our situation. You're going to have your Luther moment. What is God calling you to do? Is God calling you to take a stand before the ordination board? Is that your moment where you say, you know what? This is not redeeming. This version of the gospel that the church has taught and that's raised me is not the redeeming gospel of Jesus Christ for this and this reason. God desires all to be saved in Jesus Christ, and God elects and rejects all so that so do your universal salvation, or do your Jesus isn't actually fully God, just the one who brings us the ministerial vision. Is that the moment for you to say, this I believe when I can do no other, and I'm going to bring this prophetic witness to you, the ordination board? Because you need to hear it. Because the church's understanding of the gospel isn't good news for the world today. And then they go, all right, good luck elsewhere. So you get to, or do you say, okay, I know I'm before a conservative ordination board. I feel called to the United Methodist Church, even though it is wrong on the gay issue and it needs to broaden its understanding of universal salvation, whatever it is. But I can't get there and work within the church unless I'm in the church. They have to let me in first. So is God calling you to strategically speak the language of Zion for those who know the language of Zion and answer the questions in the way that you know that the traditional church wants to know? That you can do that now, right? You've had lots of systematic theology. You know the logic and how it works and how it can be perfectly powerful understanding of the gospel, even though you have your problems with it. Do you do that to get in and so that you can do the work that God has called you to do to transform the church from the inside out?
Yeah.
This is up to you. I don't know. This is between you and God. But this is what I'm assuming is part of most of our journey, right? We have to decide when we find ourselves thinking differently from the context we're in, what is called for? What's God calling you to do? to now speak out loudly about what I think is wrong with the shared assumptions of the context, or to be politic and to choose your moments and to try to work alongside and look for the moments to raise certain questions that might invite the group to start thinking differently together, right? There's different ways of working. You have to, it's between you and your own journey with God about what you're going to do when. So in answer to the question, that's the challenge. What I'm hoping this class do for you is equip you to make that discerning decision a little bit more in a more of an informed way. So you know what the contexts are, you know where the landmines are, whether it's a conservative context or a progressive context, you know who your neighbor is, and somewhat about how they're thinking about how this is good news. So you can both disagree with them and agree with them in an informed and respectful way. And choose your moments.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yes, 5 minutes.
What paradigm are you?
Well, let's have a vote.
Right.
Who thinks I'm paradigm A?
You are.
I think you're.
Well, let's show of hands. One.
What percentage?
What? Well, this is where if there are forks in the road, push comes to shove, even if I might be here rather than here, am I still, push comes to shove, paradigm A? Which would mean what? God gets the saving done only in Jesus Christ.
Right.
That's one way, right? One way. So who thinks I'm paradigm A? Even if on the left side. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? Okay.
You're a little bit.
Who thinks I'm B? Who thinks Paul Tillich is my Lord and Savior? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, not the same. Who thinks Dolores Williams is my Lord and Savior? Paradigm C, liberationist. 1, 2, 3. A little bit more. Slightly. Pretty even though. 7 or 8. I think.
7?
This means that I have done my job well. And I can cast my big fat check in clear conscience. Because if I'm teaching this class right, I'm making a strong case for every possibility. Each of these three has a strong case to make. And each of these three has its blind spots. And my job is to make you feel the power of the position and the risks of each position in as equal a way as I can. And it seems like I kind of got close. But yeah, I am a baby. I believe in Jesus as the Word of God for all salvation. Don't tell the dean, please don't tell the But so in all honesty, I am here. So God gets the saving done in Jesus alone, but everyone is saved. And everyone's going to be there. Somehow through God's grace. It's not about some going to heaven, most going to heaven, some going to hell. The saving that gets done in Jesus is universally, objectively true for all the world. So that's how I am very close to be as an A person. I need the universal scope of the good news. It has to be good news for all. And
Your parents' names.
God's pardon?
CA.
Yeah, but I would be A close to C rather than being CA. I'm not a liberation theologian because I'm a white dude at the top of the pile for one. Whose particular historical experience of oppression am I going to speak from? Because I don't have one. But I have been converted by liberation theology and feminist theology, and that might have been through. So, even if it comes down to theological method, I still want Scripture to be authoritative in a very uncomfortable way. I can't begin with experience. I'm really close because the salvation that God works in Jesus alone for all the world has to be about folks getting out of Egypt now, not just about disembodied souls sitting on clouds in heaven. Salvation has a historical, political dimension. It's about writing the relationship between me and folks of color and women and all those who are marginalized by structures that privilege me in the context I live in. I am called and being saved by the grace of God in Jesus Christ to locate myself there, acknowledge the way I'm implicit in all these structures of sin, and pray that God will help me find ways to climb off the top of the pile and be in solidarity with God's work of redemption that is real liberation from structures of oppression, which liberates me from the top of the pile while it's liberating those from the bottom of it. So that's how, don't tell anybody, but I'm mostly still A. But I've been converted by both B and C, so I'm very close to the intersection. Anyone want to argue strongly? Come on, that makes sense. All right, we are done. Good job, guys.
Why did we do so many paragraphs? C pages? Why did we do so many paragraphs? C pages?
Because,
That was why I was thinking.
right. It's because we have a lot to make. The tradition has ignored the C voices for so long that I feel like we have